So, to today's event, looking beyond the pandemic, what's next for International HRM? I'm delighted that we have our three presenters here with us today. We have Dana Minbaeva from Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. And Dana is a professor at the Department of Strategy and Innovation and is also the Vice President for International Affairs there. Her research on strategic international HRM has appeared in top international journals, numerous book chapters and reports. She received several national and international awards for research achievements, including the prestigious Journal of International Business Decade Award for 2013. Her work is highly influential in the field, and I'm very pleased that Dana is able to present here today. Our second presenter is Helen DeCieri. Helen is a professor at Monash Business School at Monash University in Australia, and many thanks to Helen for being here today, because I think it's gone 11 p.m. in the evening, so staying up late for this event. Her current research activities combine her interests in international HRM and employee health and well-being. Her publications include articles in journals such as Human Resource Management, Journal of World Business, and Accident Analysis and Prevention. And our third presenter that we have is Angelika Zimmermann. Angelika is a senior lecturer in international business and strategy at Loughborough University, School of Business and Economics in the United Kingdom. Her current research centers on cross-boundary collaborations in global teams and multi-stakeholder initiatives. Her work has been published in journals such as Journal of World Business, International Journal of Management Reviews, and Information Systems Journal. So welcome, Angelika, also. And at this point, we're about to hand over for the main presentation. Everybody should be able to see the slides for the presentation now. And I'm just checking that everybody is ready. So I am going to hand over to Dana to start the presentation. Thank you very much, Dana.
Yes, and thank you very much, Elaine, for a nice introduction, and thank you very much, organizers, for putting this together. It's so much needed, and I'm sure it's going to be great success. So, although it's just three of us here, Helen, Angelika, and myself, we would like to acknowledge the contribution of our colleagues, Paula DeCieri and Alain Verbeeke, who co-authored with us the GIPS editorial that somehow served, I guess, or provoked the invitation to this IHRM webinar series. And just to explain how it all started, Boston Consulting Group calls the ongoing pandemic a people-based crisis. And at the end of March, The Economist wrote that when financial crisis rocked the business in 2007, 2009, corporate boardrooms turned to CFOs, corporate financial chiefs. However, that COVID-19 pandemic, The Economist continues, presents a very different challenge and highlights the role of another corporate function, often unfairly dismissed as soft. In this pandemic, the eyes are on HR, and HR is expected to set the tone. And it's understandable, because this is not a financial crisis, it's a human crisis. And to deal with a human crisis, it's clear that organizations must have a detailed understanding of own human capital, and that capital must be handled in an outstanding way. The question that HR people raised was how? As one of the HR executives said, no one was trained for that, and there was no playbook. Or was there? We in international business know a lot about managing on distance. And particularly in international HRM, we have accumulated a body of knowledge that gives us a very good understanding, a solid understanding of the challenges that people face when placed in a wide range of MNC's work arrangements, such as expatriate assignments, virtual international work, global project teams, frequent travelers, you name it. And we believe that this academic knowledge is particularly useful for HR managers today as they face new challenges and difficult decisions during this pandemic. So the purpose of our editorial that is just came out, here's the reference at the bottom of the slide, basically was not to conduct a comprehensive review of the literature, but rather the goal was to select a few key themes that would offer an opportunity for quote unquote quick wins. That means that they could be immediately applied in managerial practices, and that these insights could serve to guide managers in HR and beyond, as these managers try to address these novel people-related challenges in their organizations. And that was an idea of the editorial, and we had to move fast. So what actually, just a little bit of an anecdote in here, we really utilized working on distance. So the paper traveled with the time, going from me to Angelika to Paula to Alan to Helen. So next morning, the first thing that I opened my computer at 6 o'clock in the morning, I had a new version of the paper. So that was a truly international collaboration on distance. However, the experience with this editorial, but also generically, experience with pandemic has also highlighted some gaps in our research. Answers to the questions we wish we had in academic literature, but to date do not. And that's what that's why in this webinar, what we would like to focus on is not on the kind of, these insights and quick wins that we focused on editorial, but actually, continue the discussion and focus on our recommendations for future HR scholarship in the post-pandemic reality. We think, and I'm jumping to some of the final notes that we're going to say at the end, we think that novel and multidisciplinary research will be needed to address the context, process, and outcomes of post-pandemic HR as an academic field as well. So in this webinar, we focus especially on suggestions for research on how to manage with global uncertainty, how to facilitate global work, and how to redefine organizational performance. All of that in the context of future HR research. And I'm gonna give a floor right now to Helen, who will take the first part.
Thanks, Dana, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to focus firstly on the context of international HRM. And researchers in our field will be familiar with the concept of the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment, the VUCA environment. And the health and economic crises that have resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic have given us a whole new understanding of this notion of a VUCA environment. It's given us much further significance of the importance of understanding the context. So global uncertainty in particular has become an ongoing long-term context for many employees, people who are working from home for the first time, experiencing job instability and job insecurity, financial insecurity, as well as worrying about their own health and the health and safety of their loved ones. So during the past few months, we've seen examples of companies trying to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, some better than others. And we want to bring the lessons learned during the pandemic into the future so that we can try to understand how this incredible change of the world as we know it has affected international business travellers and people who do globally mobile work for multinational enterprises and in the whole range of organisations around the global workforce and work context. So we know that we need to plan to live with uncertainty for a long time. Things like return to work plans must be flexible to allow for multiple cycles. It's going to go up and down for quite some time. We know that companies such as Twitter have announced that they'll allow their employees to work from home indefinitely. When they do open, they'll do it with careful, staged, gradual processes. MasterCard have announced that they will allow their employees to continue to work from home until their fears of contracting COVID-19 subside. MasterCard employed 20,000 people worldwide. So how is this going to work? So we know context is important. As researchers, we want to understand what we might be able to contribute for companies that are trying to deal with this uncertainty. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to focus on the first of the three issues within our context, that is leadership and talent management. With regard to leadership, we know from international HR research by Paula Caligiuri and colleagues that the multinational enterprise leaders who succeeded most in novel and uncertain situations in the past have demonstrated three cultural agility related responses. First, they've had the skills to adapt, to leverage responses, to draw in knowledge from local people who have expertise. In the context of the pandemic, it may mean that we need to draw in the expertise of health and safety experts that perhaps have not had as much of a voice in the strategic HR space in the past. Also, M&E leaders need to be able to integrate diverse perspectives and really be able to find solutions, even when the demands are conflicting, even when the perspectives may be conflicting, to bring together an integrated solution. And a third response that helps leaders to succeed is to be able to provide direction, even when it's not popular, even when it's not welcome, to be able to share news such as there'll be changes to the workforce. Downsizing is happening in many organisations. And a leader's responsibility needs to be able to be communicating to employees the kinds of expectations they can have of their organisation. So the sorts of research ideas we might want to explore include trying to understand what the role of leaders might be post-pandemic or in the new normal. What role does communication and support from leaders play? How do we help employees who are dealing with very real fears about their future, understanding that people are having emotional responses to the health and economic threats that they're experiencing, and the leadership behaviours that can help to move them into more rational responses. We know from social psychology that the support and communication can be important. We also know that while these may be universal leadership behaviours, there may be a need for, likely will be a need for, culturally sensitive responses. We know that uncertainty avoidance is one of the national characteristics that Hofstadter and Globe researchers has identified as being a primary cultural difference. So future research could examine questions such as cultural differences in what leadership behaviours are required. With regard to global talent management, we can also recognise that the experience of travelling as an expatriate or an international business traveller, the competencies developed in experiencing new circumstances and new environments may provide us with insights into how to deal with globally uncertain times. So research questions could explore, for example, how the reality of long-term high uncertainty could influence and be reflected in selection, development, and retaining talent and international employees into the future in a highly uncertain environment. Now, the next slide that I'm going to talk about focuses on collaborating under stress. We know that from international HR research that when we work in teams across international borders, that certain competencies will affect the success. And when we're working under stress and with people from different cultures, that can be particularly important to understand. So future research could explore whether the collaborations that we've done via virtual means have helped to strengthen relationships between colleagues from different cultures, or maybe it's had the opposite effect. And perhaps we need to identify what conditions and what interventions we need to help us overcome the virtual barriers, the lack of non-verbal cues when you're operating virtually, for example, and how we can help people to collaborate most effectively in the future. So moving on to the next slide, we also want to focus particularly on the health and safety aspect. And if the COVID-19 pandemic has shone a spotlight on HR, it's specifically shone the spotlight on the health and safety responsibilities of organisations. The COVID-19 pandemic has really shown that managing employees' health and safety is a key challenge and a responsibility for international HR. And it's an important component of the broader grand challenge of international business in understanding how to deal with social responsibility. So what kind of research could we do that could help to inform organisations around this area? For example, we could collaborate with health-based knowledge and draw on their expertise to understand the long-term health implications of exposure to risk, of working from home, of travel bans, because people have experienced such a change in their work. And we also know that the stresses caused by the demands of virtual work are real for many employees. So our scholars need to lift their gaze, broaden our focus from outcomes such as job satisfaction or employee commitment to really think about the long-term health aspects, mental health aspects such as issues of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, which has been recognised as an issue under COVID lockdown conditions, and really try to apply that to understand how can we make our workplaces healthy and safe. How do we make travel safe as people start to move out into the world again? And finally, to understand which bundles or configurations of our international HR policies are going to be associated with safety and health outcomes, both positive and which ones may be negative and need to be addressed. We've already had work from experts such as David Guest in the HR field, expertise of various researchers working and looking at health and safety and security issues in extreme environments. And these all could help to inform the future research in our field to help us move into the new normal. Thank you. Elaine, are there any questions so far?
Many thanks, Helen. We do not have clarification questions at the moment. I'll give it a few seconds to see if anybody pops anything up. But it is all perfectly clear and we're understanding all of the huge challenges ahead of us in terms of actual practice, but also the research questions we should be addressing. I think we're good to move on to Angelika at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So Helen is focused mostly on the changes in the context of work after and during and after this pandemic. I will focus on what we had to say about the process and particularly on new questions regarding how to facilitate global work in the future. So when we look at this pandemic, we can really see it has amplified, brought to the foreground new ways that our global work can be accomplished. A lot of that, as we said, we've known already, but it has shown a lot of new things as well. And that encourages us to reconsider two things that we've singled out. Firstly, how multinational enterprises use global teams and virtual collaboration. And secondly, international assignments. So I'm going to focus on these two aspects regarding the processes and how to facilitate global work in the future. Could we move on to the next slide? Okay, so when we think about global teams, first of all, we can assume that they've all experienced getting through it together. So this pandemic is a global stressor. Everyone has experienced it, but maybe people in different countries have experienced it in different ways, have experienced different responses through it. maybe they also had cultural differences in how they actually dealt with this uncertainty and so on. So that raises the questions. Has this actually fostered greater team cohesion where we're all in the same boat by getting through it together? Or has it actually made the subgroups within global teams more clear along the national fault lines? Was it very difficult to support each other across the difference via virtual media and so on? Now, another phenomenon is that global teams have also exposed what we call the full selves or the true selves through these video conferences. We all know it now. We've seen each other's background, furniture, maybe family, pets, and so on. That actually does make a difference for their relationships, but we don't know to what extent it really matters. Whether that actually supports the expectance of the others being truthful, knowing more about them, also perhaps being more reliable because you have more insight into what the other person is. So the open question is, has this virtual collaboration during this very stressful situation fostered greater team cohesion, or actually maybe led to the opposite or something in between? And then perhaps the most important question for international human resource management research is, has the prior training in cross-cultural collaboration, cross-cultural virtual collaboration actually made a difference? So have those global teams that have received such training been better at going through it together? Did they manage to come out with greater cohesion, better team identity? Or did we actually need something else? Did we need more? Did we need additional kinds of training? So these are very important questions to ask. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, so we can also take a broader look. We can go a step further and argue that this crisis really provides a new opportunity to look at the fundamentals of virtual collaboration. Because we found that very large sections of society for the very first time currently rely exclusively on virtual communication. So this exclusive reliance is very unique to many large sections of society in order not just to work remotely, but also complete collaborated tasks. So it's about collaboration. And in methodological terms, this can be called an extreme case scenario. And these scenarios are very useful for singling out certain phenomena, certain factors. So we should use this extreme case scenario to examine, firstly, how virtual collaboration can be expanded. And here we talk firstly about scale and secondly about scope. So by scale, we mean the extent. So what are the boundaries? Where does it stop? Can we rely exclusively on virtual collaboration and all work from home? Or where is the boundary? Regarding scope, that refers to new types of tasks and new forms of collaboration. So if you, for example, think of many administrators who now have to work from home, who didn't do that, we as academics may have been more used to that. Or if you think medical services that are now to a much larger extent being provided remotely. Or regarding the forms of collaboration, we all get the first-hand experience of these large-scale conferences that are now conducted virtually, or even workshops, interactive workshops that have to be done through virtual communication media. So this is a very good scenario to examine the boundaries. And in this situation, we may also discover new psychological and practical barriers which create these boundaries. So when there are new barriers, we may see, okay, this is the limit. Psychological boundaries could be an unwillingness, lack of skill, lack of motivation, discomfort with working over the distance and collaborating over the distance. Practical barriers could be in certain types of tasks. If you think of the medical profession, very people-oriented jobs may not be possible to do completely remotely. So because of this new situation, it is particularly useful to study those who are working from home for the very first time, because here we sort of control for prior experience and training in virtual collaboration. So those participants in a future research study would really give us the opportunity to single out differences regarding the preferences for working from home and collaborating over the distance. For example, we may find cross-national differences. Just as a guess, maybe relationship-oriented or collectivist cultures are more likely to want to return to the workplace, but that may be a prejudice, a question that is really worth asking. Get generational differences. We all know the digital natives, those who have actually grown up with social media and so on. Do they prefer working from home at distance, or do they also need a certain amount or maybe large amount of social interaction to do work collaboratively? Or functional differences. So this is related to the type of tasks. Maybe technical tasks are different from person-oriented tasks, sales function, services, medical services, and so on. So here we can really study certain differences regarding certain factors in preferences for working and collaborating from home. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, so an important question, critical question for international human resource management research is, of course, whether the methods that we know to support effective virtual collaboration are sufficient for scaling it up. So if we have to scale up this working from home, collaborating at home, traveling less, can we rely on well-known methods, or do we need more? So well-known methods include, for example, that you have to match the type of ICT, information communication technology, that you use with the focal task. Use synchronous communication media such as video conferences more for complex tasks like problem solving or crucial decision making, and information exchange could be done more effectively, more efficiently via, for example, shared platforms and so on. What we also have known for a long time now is that leaders need to create shared understanding of the task through creating strong shared goals. They need to foster a shared team identity, a very clear communication structure, and clear interaction rules and team member roles. So these things are very well established. We should now examine to what extent they really are enough for supporting this new scale of virtual collaboration. Perhaps a little bit less practiced methods are, for example, supporting perceived proximity. So perceived proximity is the psychological distance or proximity that you feel, and that may be actually less. You may feel closer to colleagues who are geographically very far away than to those who are in the same office. And that depends on, for example, shared identity, personal and professional identity, and also the frequency and quality of the communication. So to support this, managers could allow people to really engage in personal communication, even use social media to exchange personal information with their remote colleagues, particularly across national boundaries. The more this is an international setting, the more boundaries there are to cross. And then international human resource management really needs to think whether they should make virtual collaboration skills and also the effort to support remote colleagues a more important criterion in each stage of the international human resource management process. So, for example, when selecting and recruiting employees in this increasingly or now more virtual environment, it's probably really more and more important now to make sure that working virtually is part of the job description and part of the professional identity of those that we recruit. That it's not seen as something additional, like something necessary but not very motivating. And then of course we need training, and here we've got all the question about, do we need additional training for virtual collaboration? And performance appraisals could also really take into account the increased need of virtual collaboration. So for example, perhaps it is necessary to reward the effort, the process of communicating, being there for remote colleagues, and not just the actual performance of the global team. These are open questions though. This hasn't been examined that much in this new setting, so these are future questions. Okay, I'll go on for the next slide to international assignments. So we can assume that in the future, for a long time at least, fewer expatriates will be sent abroad. And that raises the questions whether their function can be in any way replaced. So for example, are there alternative control mechanisms for subsidiaries? Expatriates often were sent abroad to monitor, control, support the subsidiaries. Are there more technology-driven control mechanisms? The next question would be, are there alternatives for developing future M&E leaders? So often an expatriate assignment is actually a key trajectory for becoming a high-level leader or global leader. And maybe there are alternatives like providing more intercultural collaboration or team experiences domestically within the same country, or other alternatives that we don't know of yet. Are there also alternatives for addressing skills shortages in M&E host countries? So we may need more virtual means of training, because often expatriates were also sent there to transfer knowledge and skills. If this is not possible, what are the alternatives? Can we go on to the next slide now, please? So if we look at the remaining expatriates, there will still be expatriates. They will have to achieve greater success faster. So their stake is really bigger, and the speed of their adjustment will now be paramount, probably even more than before. And that again raises more questions. For example, who is best able to adjust to the novel work environment? So in this very stressful, uncertain environment during the pandemic, did we see differences in how people adjusted? We know a lot about, as Helen said, about the individual differences or the skills for adjusting to uncertain situations. In this new environment, it may have been actually particularly difficult for globally mobile employees and expatriates to suddenly work from home. So maybe they were really used to jet hopping, going to different hotels, being in different countries, doing all these business dinners. So suddenly they're actually restrained. So they may feel some kind of loss of having to work at home, possibly with their family. So maybe new work-life family boundaries have to be negotiated. They actually will need additional support, and who is best able to adjust in this situation. So leading on to the next question, to what extent have the support practices that were offered to foster employee adjustment to this new work-life situation in this pandemic, to what extent were they enough? And to what extent maybe do we need new ones? For example, as maybe now experienced in this time of working from home, maybe there are new opportunities to examine flexible work arrangement also for expatriates. So there is a lot of research on flexible working, a little bit recently also about flexible work arrangement for global teams, but not so much for expatriates. So maybe they can travel less, maybe they can work more virtually, but we still need to examine to what extent that is possible, desirable, and how it needs to be supported. So these were the main points I wanted to highlight from our editorial regarding the process of facilitating global work. And I'd like to ask whether there are any questions now at the moment.
Thank you very much, Angelika. That we have two questions that I think speak to the clarification piece that I'd like to raise with you. One of them I think you may have addressed, but there's an opportunity to say more if you would like to. The other I think is a new topic. So the first one is, how would virtual collaborations deviate from our current understanding of virtual teams? So you spoke to that a little, but whether there's anything additional you could say on that point. The second question is related to expatriation, and whether with the current trends that you're talking about within expatriation, do you believe that this is going to lead to an increase in gender disparity? So the first question is around virtual collaborations and how that's affecting virtual teams.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting questions, both of them. And the difference, so if I understood it right, so what's different compared to what we already know about global virtual teams? I think the key is that it's a new scale and a new scope. So there are, of course, people who have been working in global virtual teams for a long time. So maybe large parts of the work were already through collaborative work was already through this virtual collaboration. So they're maybe already good with building relationships over the distance, leading the virtual team, using the technology and so on. But there are also many people who do it now for the first time. So this affects not just the global virtual teams, of course, but also domestic virtual teams. For those who have worked in global virtual teams, what is not there anymore at the minute, and which may really decrease, is the travel. So I've done quite a bit of research on global virtual teams myself, and one thing I always heard was the key to building the relationship is this visit at the other country, where you see each other, where you go into each other's houses, maybe do socialize together and so on. So is there any way of maybe not completely replacing that, but living with less of that? And how can we do that? So we need to really, I think, boost up all the other means of virtual collaboration. One other thing is the scope. So for different types of tasks, we know a lot about global virtual teams composed of software engineers, because IT was offshored, outsourced for a long time. Management, some different types of technical work, but there are also global collaborations which have been studied less. So it would be really interesting, for example, in the medical profession, how can collaboration work more virtually there? Does that answer the question, or I think we can't?
Yeah, I think that's very good. The second question was related to expatriation, and whether you could say something briefly around whether you expect this to increase gender disparity, please.
Personally, I would think that the responsibility for particularly children is usually still more with the female sides, even for expatriates. And I think this is not something that is specific to expatriates, but probably the load may be more on women to actually multitask by doing more of homeschooling and getting their work done at the same time. But that may not be in the forever, but it may be for quite a while now.
Thank you, Angelika. There are lots of questions coming in, but we're going to save those until the Q&A at the end now. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back over to Dana, please.
Yes, and what a question. Just before I get to my part, I just laughed the question and actually maybe have a little bit provocative kind of take on it. We could come back to that at the end, but let me just flag it. It may be that the end of global mobility is a great thing for gender diversity, or generically diversity per se. Suddenly local talent, the immobile talent becomes interesting. Individuals who traditionally do not travel become uninvolved. And actually what we, in another project that we're doing right now here in Denmark, we actually found that virtual meetings, virtual collaboration there is much more democracy in the virtual meeting rooms. That's what one of our participants told us. But I mean, let's come back to that. I think brilliant question. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for Helen and Angelika. If you remember at the beginning, we said that there are 3 areas that we'd like to talk about. So Helen talked about how to manage with global uncertainty, and Angelika talked about how to facilitate global work. And I would like to talk about the 3rd area where we believe future research should be paying attention, and that is around redefining performance. And we talked about it before. international HR scholars need to rethink their key dependent variable, being organizational performance. Some years ago now, Helen and we wrote a chapter that where we suggested to shift the focus from performance towards organizational resilience. We were building very much on the work that Helen, you did with Peter Darling. And by organizational resilience, we meant literally the organizational ability to bounce back from the shock events. We refer to that ability as important outcome variable for HR in the, you could say back then, like fluid environments. Interestingly, that at that time, our thinking was steered by other shock events. Among those was the global financial crisis. There was natural disasters, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, Icelandic volcano, environmental disaster, BP, Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion. So actually coming back to that, now we can say we can place COVID in that long list of shock events of the 21st century and use this opportunity to stress again our previous message. The global pandemic once again stresses the importance of understanding the role of international HR in building organizational resilience. Because it's not a question if, but the question when the next crisis hits us. The crisis also brings home the point that sustainability, and more specifically SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, should become a dependent variable in international HR research. As is the case with other environmental disasters, the COVID-19 crisis has been directly linked to the unsustainable ways in which humans treat the world's ecosystem. I know it's debatable, but when seen through this lens, the COVID-19 crisis should alert us to the need to rethink our working practices to help address environmental sustainability. I have to say that unintentionally, we, international HR researchers, may in the past have contributed to environmentally unsustainable working practices by, for example, promoting frequent international travel in the instances where such travel could have been easily avoided or replaced by more environmentally friendly, shall we say, modes of professional interactions. And the current crisis now provides an opportunity for us, the HRM community, could say, to adjust it or maybe even to correct it by examining how virtual working can be optimized to reduce, not to extinguish completely, but to reduce the extent of commuting and travel. In addition to examining the sustainability of the global HR policies and practices, future research should also address these sustainable development goals with respect to the global health and safety. Again, for example, by examining how global mobility practices integrate health and safety matters in the long run. Now, we will also need to redefine who in performance, because again, in HR, or international HR in particular, we have been focusing way too much on a high status professional employees. I hope that the future research, or we hope that the future research should give attention to MNC's entire workforce, and maybe even beyond the traditional CSR, focus on addressing the needs of individuals for whom the crises like COVID-19 pandemic accelerated conditions of insecurity, disempowerment, vulnerability. And this is particularly important given that SDGs highlight the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, as well as reduction in inequality, which are issues that will be intensified in what likely to be post-pandemic global recession. So we need, the international HR community, we need to better understand the role of globalization from the perspective of local value creation and greater community engagement. Here are some questions that we suggest for future international HRM scholarship. or researchers interested in moving that direction, what should be performance indicators in the next normal? Again, that normal in which it's not a question if, but when the next crisis hits. How to build organizational resilience worldwide, globally. In our editorial, we have outlined that international HR researchers should use the current extreme scenario of virtual working to examine, scrutinize, if you wish, the boundaries of effective virtual collaboration and find the means to support it on a broader scale. Whatever it's going to be, the next normal is going to be different. No, we are not coming back to, the world that we left, for example, in Denmark on March 12th, when the country closed. And during this lockdown, people experienced new ways of working together. And I shall say, there have been, lots of ups and downs. There was lots of emotional distress. But now, looking back at the last 15 weeks, there are quite a few HR professionals, managers we interviewed said, it actually went okay. We somehow embraced that technology. We accepted all that with all these inefficiencies and problems, and somehow agreed to went to that grand rehearsal of how our digital future would look like. And I doubt that after that experience, we just kind of quietly go back. So maybe many professionals may have probably become more open to the idea of reducing or revisiting unnecessary travel. And perhaps some international HR researcher may be more inclined than before to search for the new avenues to capitalize on virtual working and thereby foster unsustainable management practices in this realm. You could say we cannot not mention the Peter Buckley and his colleagues who, in the 2017 identified the potential, or rather criticized IB scholarship for not catching up on big questions and grand challenges. And I think using this opportunity that experience of COVID-19 pandemic provided us with, we actually now have more than opportunity, we have a responsibility to join this conversation. And actually we have a great opportunity to contribute with insights about how multinationals could manage their global workforce in the next normal. So just instead of conclusion, I just wanted to say that on behalf of all authors, we want to conclude that the experience of the COVID-19 crisis showed again that the useful knowledge in the field of international HR, the knowledge that could inform and support managerial practices in the time of need, actually remained quite dispersed and fragmented. And there are many reasons for that. But nevertheless, what we've learned through the experience of working with this editorial and preparation to this webinar, that the most interesting insights are coming from the research that is multidisciplinary in nature. That research that multi-stakeholder orientated, that research that goes just beyond the business of every business to do business philosophy, the research that asks questions at multiple levels and seeing the reality as being, nested, complex, emergent system, and definitely from the methodologically pluralist research. And we do believe that that is how the future of international HRM scholarship should look like, for us to perform a valuable role in answering big questions and dealing with grand challenges in international business in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. And just to, a point of clarification just on what you were presenting before we move to the general open Q&A, but there's a lot of very interesting questions coming up here. But this particular question focuses a little bit on the multi-level piece that you just mentioned in the conclusion there. So talking about performance and MNEs, and there's a question around what's the impact from the national level, so national politics, government in different countries. How is that expected to affect international HR practices of multinationals going forward after the post-COVID era?
Yes, and I hope that some of you managed to follow the JIPS and JIPS Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Politics webinars, where these questions been already discussed. And I also hope that many of you would attend the Academy of International Business that's done virtually, starting very soon, next week actually, where these questions are going to be seriously, discussed in a very detail. I personally, my answer changed as we continued through the pandemic, because at the very beginning, you could say, when everything got closed, when personally I realized that I'm not going to see my parents for at least, in the best case scenario, 1 year, somehow being kind of locked, isolated in the local environment, raised certain questions. And you could say that I guess I am an international worker. Over time, however, when we started seeing how companies creatively decided or managed to reconstruct their global value chain and use kind of neighboring regions and being flexible with the contracts and find substitutions, etc. I thought that, okay, well, there is lots of hope. Actually, we also noticed that multinational companies, they actually bounced back quicker. Multinational companies had this transition from physical to digital and back to physical that we're experiencing right now in Denmark. They managed that transition much smoother. So you could say, wow, there is really something about these organizational capabilities that multinational companies have, that international business and international relations provide or create within the individuals. And then gradually, also after the, governments announced the reopening of borders, increased nationalism, you could say, and protectionism of goods in that, or particular services that would kind of be first and foremost oriented on the local market. So to your short clarifying question, my answer is very long, so it's going really upside down. And I guess right now, any kind of fluctuation looks so big because we are right now in the context. I think we'll have to, distance ourselves far enough from here to understand what it actually matters. But emotionally, I'm up and down, depending on where we are in the pandemic on that one.
Thanks, Dana, and I recognize the emotional up and down piece for sure. Okay, so there are a lot of questions. I'm going to do my best to cover as many as we can in some of the broad themes. You may not hear directly your question, but hopefully we're picking up on themes. First of all, I'm going to move initially to some of the points that Helen was raising at the start. And of course, any of the presenters can speak to this, but so a question that we have is, what does the organization's new duty of care playbook look like post-COVID-19 in terms of health, safety and security of workers going back to the office, working remotely, and as business travel starts to open up? So this duty of care playbook, that's the core question there. Helen.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to guess that's Lisbeth that's asked the question. Hello, Lisbeth. Yes, we should be paying attention to the research that's been done already by Lisbeth Klaus and others on the duty of care. I think in many ways the international HR research is way behind what's already happening in practice. I think there are organisations for whom they already have a duty of care playbook. They don't have to throw that out. If we think about organisations like mining companies, they've been sending employees to remote locations. We've got humanitarian organisations that have been sending people to hostile environments for decades. And there's a wealth of knowledge that could be drawn from those organisations in many ways. What we see though in some organisations is that the health and safety part has been managed in a way quite separate from the HR function. And I think what we could see more of is this merging, the bringing together of an understanding of total worker health, which is quite well known in the health and safety space, but hasn't really been looked at in international HR. And so I think for the HR researchers, we need to pay more attention to these issues of health and safety. If we look at reviews that have been done, some of those by us, of the international HR field and of expatriate research, health and safety has rarely made a mention. If we have paid attention to it, it's been focused on psychological well-being of employees. Psychological adjustment of expatriates has been a major theme in our research. And yet we know people have been experiencing jet lag and a sleep disturbance. And if you're an international business traveller, you have more stress than if you're a long-term expatriate. There's actually quite a wealth of knowledge that is there, particularly from researchers in the health discipline. And I'd suggest that international HR researchers could improve their playbook by paying more attention to the practical work that's already being done, and by doing more multidisciplinary research, learning from what knowledge is already out there in the health sector particularly. I don't know if that's answered the question, but there are some thoughts.
Thanks very much, Helen. Do either of the other presenters want to speak to that point at all? Okay. Well, we will continue on. The next question, it's quite broad. I think it speaks predominantly to the area that Angelika was looking at, but again, open to all the presenters. The question is, what research questions could be raised as regards changes in global mobility and consequences for talent supply post-COVID-19?
So is the question mainly regarding talent? So rather than simply globally mobile employees, generally, particularly talent?
It's a mixture of the changes in global mobility and then what that means for the supply of talent. So if we have, how is the pool of talent changing as global mobility and expatriation might be changing?
Yeah. I guess, I mean, my feeling is that one very important aspect here is really how to have a formal talent pool, because often if you've got a high potential talent pools, identified people who then get a certain training program, often a very important part of that was moving between the different countries. So maybe that needs to be done in a slightly different way, for example, more domestically. So that might be one difference. Perhaps also HRM researchers need to look at the organizational structure, how much that actually supports talent being developed in subsidiaries which are not at the key nodes of the network. I think there's quite a bit of research there already on how often talent at the subsidiaries gets overlooked. And maybe this is an opportunity when you don't just have the formal talent pool, but you need to think of alternative talent development methods to actually embed it in the organizational structure to make sure that staff is equally recognized at the different subsidiaries. I don't know, Dana, whether you want to say something about that, because it's this talent management.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And we discussed it a lot, remember, while we were writing the tutorial, because it is problematic. I could say that if you think about the area of global talent management, the pandemic question its very core, global. And you could say global mobility was very often assumed in the global talent management. It was embedded in the programs. So the question that I guess I'm rephrasing now, Angelika, is how can we attract, develop, and retain global talent locally? And the question is not only about HR per se, right? Because it's not just in this field. I think in general, in international business overall, we suddenly take out the core assumption, the assumption of crossing borders. And you could say that it is extremely interesting times in this regard, because what we actually have been writing and talking about it for so long now suddenly being rehearsed, and we are observing the life experiment, so to say, in which the whole world was put in. And you could say, to be provocative, summarizing a little bit or building a little bit on what Helen was saying. So traveling decrease or affect negatively health and safety. Traveling affect negatively sustainability. So why do we travel? And again, just from the domestic research with Danish companies that we are doing right now, it is clear that these questions are asked, perhaps not, as a kind of a big questions on the front of the corporate offices, but these questions are asked: what's the nature of work? What's the nature of tasks that actually requires physical interactions? And in our case, in case of international HR, physical interactions crossing the borders, right? So if you think about it, the whole point of needing that kind of work at home, work at work, it's not actually that old. It's about 150 years old, right? Since industrialization, you have to have certain hours at work, and then you have to have certain hours to sleep, and then you have to have certain hours to do free time. Somehow right now everything is mixed. So what's going to happen next? So there's so many interesting questions, and I don't think it's a international HR that will only face those issues, because in everything, take global value chain, right, where there is a crucial aspect of, in fact, examinations, physical presence during the examinations of certain parts of the global value chain. So it's not just us who is going to come forward and ask all those questions, but it's us who is the closest to the answers, because we study behaviors of individuals in the challenging context.
Maybe just one little thought, my finger doesn't go. Maybe this is also an opportunity for those who cannot travel so much to become part of the talent pool. So, I mean, for example, if you now think of the gender divide, maybe those women with families who actually struggle to go into this global program where you will have to study, you will have to go abroad, and you will have to travel a lot. Maybe there will be different routes now to raise to the same hierarchical level without that much trouble.
Yeah, and that's where the diversity point comes back into discussion, right? Definitely. And gender is only one thing. What about age?
Yeah.
That, that's also obviously opens our doors. The issue that we, for example, heard from some of the leaders we've interviewed, they, for instance, said that they were surprised and overwhelmed how introverts, how people with certain disabilities suddenly shined in the virtual meeting rooms with so much of creativity, initiative, and innovation that, that really was a big surprise for the immediate managers. Right? Why so? Well, because they were in the comfort of their own homes, and they were not dominated by the usual suspects, i.e. Dominating group, whatever kind of social stereotype you would take in here, right? So I think there's lots of questions to that, absolutely. But but this is one of the most nicest outcome of the best silver lining of the COVID-19 cloud.
Good to look for the silver linings. Thank you for that. I just want to read one of the comments from one of the participants that kind of speaks to some of these points as well. This is from Angelika Zimmermann. It says, personal touch and contact was previously considered crucial in building trust and relationships, even when global collaboration, dispersed teams was already a reality. So actually, are we saying now that this kind of real personal contact piece is overrated? So we argued before that we should all be meeting with each other once a year or something to be able to facilitate other virtual conversations, but is that overrated? And he goes on to say the forced virtual work from home in the new normal is perhaps making teams closer by being more visible and available on Zoom, etc. So more access to actual FaceTime, literally FaceTime, maybe that's making a difference. And maybe, yeah, maybe there is a silver lining going on here a little. I just want to move the discussion on, and some of these things have kind of been touched on, but this is a broad question to all three presenters. It's a question around methodology. So the question is, what are your views on COVID-19's implications for international HRM research from a methodological point of view, please?
Helen, do you want to go first? I need to gather my thoughts.
Look, I would like to see this as an opportunity to rethink everything we've been doing and to explore new ways of understanding the phenomena that we want to study. So if you look at the journals that we publish in over the last decade and the last 5 years particularly, there's been increasing emphasis on highly quantitative, highly sophisticated studies. They are really valuable, but they're not the only way to do research. I think what we're seeing with all of these great questions people are asking, and with the number of questions that came into our minds as we worked on the editorial and prepared this webinar, is we need more qualitative research. There's a whole lot of answers we just don't have. There's a whole lot of great questions. It's probably a great time to be a PhD student because you really can explore original ideas. And I'm not suggesting that people have to make their career about COVID-19. What I'm suggesting is that there's a bit of a renaissance and understanding that qualitative studies, understanding different work groups, people who are working from home, people who are not only the jet setters, highly paid expatriates, but the other types of workers and groups that are in the international workforce, understanding migrants and refugees and people who've been displaced by natural disasters and by other disasters are all new areas of research. And I think, you know, it will be great to explore the kinds of new methods. I mean, I'd also like to see opportunities for much more intervention research in our field. We've done a lot of cross-sectional survey research, but what are the interventions that leaders and HR managers can implement that would really make our employees' lives better? What are the interventions that really help to reduce stress? What are the interventions that help people to cope with the distancing that they may experience by being on Zoom all the time? How can we really test the different kinds of approaches we're taking? We could also use more experience sampling methods and experimental designs. The field of international HR has, I think, had a fairly restricted range in terms of its methodologies. So this is a great opportunity to get out there and explore different ways of understanding these phenomena.
Thank you, Helen, for giving. Of course, and when I heard the question, I was like, of course there should be implications, but I'm just like, but which ones, right? So where to start? But absolutely, like specifically on your examples are really great. I was just like generically thinking, of course there should be, because we asking different questions. That's why they probably should be answered, by employing different methods. We're saying that the greatest insights are coming from the multidisciplinarity. Hence, we have to be more open to the variety of methods. And as Helen pointed out, and I 100% agree, international HR fields been dominated by cross-sectional survey, one respondent per organization, and in a sense, every time we get a submission to JIPS with interesting question, I get so excited. I'm thinking finally there is something and international we can publish in JIPS and international HR. And then when it gets to method, and it's not even close, I can see Helen as a former editor is also smiling. So absolutely encouraging the innovation, but also thinking a lot about the, triangulation. I guess some of you probably know my hobby, another one that refers to the human capital analytics and how companies could use more evidence-based, you could say, could do more evidence-based decisions. So now that we rely on the technology so much, trying to combine our surface level investigation with some data that companies are storing, maybe not actively collecting, but softwares are doing it for them, right? Actually, in one of the interviews that we did with a software development company, so that comes kind of naturally, right? And then they didn't like use it for monitoring or controlling, but they were using it because they were curious, or it's right there, and we were really amazed how much is actually out there. So thinking a little bit, what is the best way to collect the data that I need to answer this exciting research question, rather than thinking, okay, I'm gonna do a explorative interview or cross-sectional survey. So yeah, absolutely. I will just echo Ellen on that one. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. And sorry, Angelika.
I just want to say I very much agree. Just one tiny point. Also, if we are talking about such a new experience, it is also really worth examining the lived experience of different people, and that will surface a lot of differences.
Many challenges ahead. Thank you. It is challenging doing research on international topics, even through cross-sectional single-person respondent surveys. So to go into all these new fields creates extra challenges for us, but that's what we are here for. We're researchers, we love doing this, and we love facing challenges. So thanks for those ideas. There are a whole host of questions. I'm conscious on time that we probably only have one major area that we can get into. A lot of questions are around expatriation, different points being raised there. So question that I would like to raise, and perhaps Angelika can speak to this first, but others also join in. So as the mobility of international assignments is minimized, and perhaps this would remain so for a long time, is this the end of international HRM? And are we going into a new realm of what HR means from a global perspective?
Well, my first reaction would be that international HRM is not just about expatriates. But then if we think of expatriates, I would think that it's probably not an all or nothing, that some degree of expatriate management may be necessary, but they're all new potential hybrid forms of it. So for example, more flexible working, or shorter assignments combined with technological support, and so on. And so the answer to the question, is this the end of international human resource management? My answer would be no, because we still have to manage an international workforce. So it's not just about a huge amount of expatriates, but it's about much more. What do the others say about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if you think about international HRM as field that studies policies and practices of multinational corporations, is at the end of multinational corporations? Definitely not. And again, we see that MNCs actually are getting out of this in a easier way, in a smarter way, right? One of the largest Danish multinationals, for example, when we interviewed them in April, they said, well, no, it's not surprising. And we were ready back in January because we have lots of workforce in China. And when they were moving online in December, we learned from China, we learned from our Chinese subsidiary, and then, you know, we were ready here even before the crisis in Denmark. So no, of course. And as for the expatriates, you know, the global financial crisis did a good thing. It made companies to reconsider this long-term expatriation, these expensive packages, right? So started coming up with alternatives. Companies started experimenting with the so-called local plus, if you remember, right? So it's kind of a little bit questioning the main idea and then coming up with interesting alternatives. I think that something like this would also happen now, because I believe we will all, not just companies, not just researchers, but all individuals will basically, you know, again, revisit this question, why do we need to cross the borders? And if you think about it, again, multinationals are at the more favored position because of the construction, or let me rephrase it, characteristics of their human capital. Multinational MNC's human capital is extremely diverse. It consists of global human or corporate human capital, subsidiary human capital, but there is also local human capital, there's also international human capital. And maybe because right now we will be moving the focus from the individuals, i.e. expatriates, to what and why these individuals actually, you know, what do they deliver to the company. So I think that we'll have lots of call for papers for special issues. I think we're going to have lots of interesting research, particularly around these topics, simply because the main assumption behind this, one of the most classical area in international HR, is being questioned. And I tell you what, 1 year ago, I actually said that to the bunch of very heavyweighters in international business, and I was the only HR person there. And I said, well, you know, traditional expatriation per se does not really kind of exist. And they all went against me, because they said, of course it is. That's what we do in IB, right? So there is lots of things. There is lots of taking for granted things. So we have a great research agenda. Don't you think, Helen?
Yes, I agree. International HRM is at a point in the road where we have to decide what we want to contribute. I think we've fallen into a fairly complacent field where we've been quite happily focusing to some extent on what is familiar and what is comfortable. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we can't rely on what is comfortable. We've all been pushed into new, uncomfortable zones, and we have to learn how to live with that, and we should. The Sustainable Development Goals really should push us to say, what are the dependent variables we should focus on? We should be questioning what our contribution is. This year has been a wake-up call for us. And if we don't get our act together to really be much more useful to organisations, then maybe it is the end of international HR. But if we can't get our act together, then we don't deserve to hang around. We need to be able to show that what we do is of value. And I really believe that we can do that, and we already have done that in lots of ways. But there are so many more questions that we still have to answer, and we need to step up and do that.
Thank you very much. You actually anticipated my final question that I was going to put out, Helen. So things are jumping around on my screen, so it just vanished. Give me a second. Oh. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. Slight technical hitch there. So the final question I was going to raise for each of the presenters today was raised in the Q&A, and it says, what is the most important message within International HRM that we should be sharing with our students? And I think, Helen, you kind of hit the nail on the head with that last response. So I'm just going to ask Angelika and then Dana, what is the most important message within International HRM we should share with our students?
It's a very good question. So I think we should tell them that international human resource management is not just about the classic theories and the classic topics that we always taught them about, but it's also about really steering into the future. So maybe I'm repeating a bit what Helen just said, that international human resource management can really take a role in companies pursuing the sustainable development goals. And they should, as future practitioners or researchers, continue asking themselves the question of what the wider, the broader purpose of their profession or their research is in terms of these broader goals.
Yes. Oh, Helen, Helen, it's fantastic. The wake-up call, I'm gonna quote you everywhere. That's brilliant. That's really, you know, and absolutely, Angelika, as you say, it is a big issue. And I would say, what can I add to that? One thing, get out of your comfort zone. A place where our colorful context is represented as a monolithic gray, zone where you assume that the individuals are on average behaving in an average way. You know, whatever it is that makes you comfortable, take this out of the equation and see what happens. I would also add to that this period of lockdown, I guess, more for individuals, because, you know, individual research has been, we've all been through difficult times. I think it's also, you know, time for us individually to reflect, you know, create a space for reflection and say, how did I react? What questions did I ask? What questions popped out in my head? And that's probably the questions that you should address. That's the questions that you should prioritize, instead of something that's been lying on your table for the last 2 years. And, you know, you just think, okay, I'll get to that right now that I have time. No. Think about what, you know, kind of bugged you, what buzzed you, what were you annoyed with, because that's how this editorial came out. You know, we needed a channel, we needed a voice to say it now and here. And luckily, Alan was very flexible in that regard, and that's why I think it matters so much for us to bring these ideas forward. So, and thank you for the organizers again to have an opportunity to talk about them, because despite of the, you know, the paper is published, but we actually never presented it anywhere. So it's our first airing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's time for us to wrap up here. I would like to give a huge round of applause to our presenters. So thank you so much for everything, all the great ideas that you've shared. I just want to go and explore those big new ideas now and throw everything off the desk that's currently there and just get out there. The editorial has been mentioned a few times, so those of you who've not come across it yet, so published in the Journal of International Business Studies. I believe it's just currently published online. It's not actually in paper yet. The title of the editorial is International HRM Insights for Navigating the COVID-19 Pandemic, Implications for Future Research and Practice. And the authors are Paula Caligiuri, Helen DeCieri, Dana Minbaeva, Anna Verbeke, and Angelika Zimmermann. So thank you again to our three presenters, to all the organizers that helped put this together. Remember that we have got future webinars coming up, so mid-September. as registering for this seminar, you will be sent a link that gives you the recording of the seminar, so you can listen again to all the ideas. You'll see there all of the slides, so all of that information is available to you, and we'll give you further information about the next seminar when it comes up. So thank you to everybody for turning up today. Don't forget that there is a poll now on your screen to tell us what you thought of the event. So let us know about it, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.